Good morning, everyone. It's Monday, September 28th.
Dr. Flores, I think you're muted.
Oh, I don't think I'm muted. Shoot. No, I can hear you.
Sorry, that must be my audio then. I just wanted to double check.
Okay. I was like, I don't think
Try
I
to figure it out.
to restart my computer. Okay, we're all good. Good morning, everyone. It is September 28th, the last Monday of September. We're just going to be continuing on with toddlerhood this morning. So that's all our focus is. It's just a friendly reminder that your original post for your discussion board number 2 is due on Friday. This does require you to raise your virtual child through age 5. So if for whatever reason you have not kept up with your virtual modules, you need to contact Miley or myself to extend those deadlines so that you can raise your virtual child and complete your discussion board original post for Friday. The peer response is due a week from today on Monday. Remember, those are never due the same day, and the deadline in Canvas always gives you the deadline for the peer response, not the original post. So just a little clarification there. Okay, with that said, I'm going to dive into, I gotta share my screen, 1 second. All right, I'm going to pull up, there we go. So we left off, we didn't get a chance to talk about weaning. Weaning itself is essentially, as the biological mother, you decide a particular time when it's appropriate to stop breastfeeding your child. And I'm going to talk about a couple of ways that women might do this, cross-culturally speaking, and also why you might decide to wean your child. So at least historically speaking, we know that for thousands of years in human history, breastfeeding for 2 to 3 years was typical. That means until your toddler is about 2 to 3 years old. So obviously walking around. This is less common now. In fact, it's more common for a woman to try and breastfeed for about 6 months to a year, give it her best effort and hope that it pays off in terms of the overall health and long-term cognitive development of the baby. Some different cultural approaches that are mentioned in your book. The first one is that in Bali, they have kind of a mix of gentle and harsh to try and wean the baby off breastfeeding. So do we remember what the Balinese do to try and keep their child from breastfeeding, their toddler, I guess? Any thoughts? I'll give you a hint. It's something that is put on the breast.
I don't know if this is correct, but is it like they rub some bitter herbs on there or something like that?
Yeah, and I think someone might have joined in the chat there. Let me see. Yeah, some herbs that they put on the breast that actually just don't taste good to the baby, right? Because they're anticipating a sweet taste, and that's a very bitter taste. And so they are classically conditioned not to want to breastfeed anymore. Every time they go to feed, the mother has rubbed on some herbs and then they kind of recoil. They don't want that taste. So they stop breastfeeding, and then they just transition into full-time solid food eating. So that's one approach. Another interesting approach is the Fulani people, where they actually physically separate the mother from the baby. The baby's just spending time with other family members, and obviously you can imagine not very happy. Anecdotally speaking, I've been in this situation where my older sister was trying to wean her youngest child. So she went away for like let's say, I think it was about a 3 or 4 day trip while I was watching him, and he kept me up every single night crying. So it's a very kind of harsh and traumatic experience for the baby, having that separation, because they're so accustomed to feeding and they don't have that gradual progression of not having access to their mother. So why do we think, at least today, what might motivate a mother to wean her child to stop breastfeeding? there can be a variety of answers for this also.
Could one be like if she has to go back to work?
Yeah, maybe she's trying to work full time perhaps, and pumping could be challenging given her actual career. So she might decide to stop feeding then. I'm gonna take a look at our chat too. I see her job, other kids, which is a great point. So if she's falls pregnant, her doctor is going to recommend that she stops breastfeeding her present child because the change in hormones can really affect the composition of the breast milk. Ooh, the baby grows teeth. Great point, Jaslyn. And also daycare as well, right? So they might begin to wean the child slowly, gradually. Oftentimes, a lot of my friends have told me that they approach weaning by reducing one feeding every couple of days. So if they would breastfeed their child normally like 4 or 5 different days during the day, then they would reduce it by one feeding, like not feeding between breakfast time and lunchtime, for example, and then eventually taking away the lunchtime feeding and introducing more solid foods at that time until they have narrowed it down to a single feeding, which is usually at nighttime, that last feeding to help them fall asleep at night. And then they eventually change the routine entirely of the child so that they have a new bedtime routine that excludes that last feeding. And I like how incorporating more nutrients into the diet, I mean, this is obviously a motivation because they want them to have a more well-rounded diet, but remember, like, breastfeeding is kind of the total package when it comes to nutrients. I think the growing teeth is a really good point. It can be difficult for mothers. This might motivate them to stop breastfeeding if it becomes really painful once their child has more teeth and they may not learn to stop biting on the nipple, which could obviously be painful. So there's quite a few different motivations, but I would say, at least historically speaking, the traditional weaning would happen when the mother was pregnant again. And today, of course, career and other motivations can take place and motivate the mother to begin to slowly wean her child. So I want to just underscore the fact that establishing new routines is really key to keeping your child from getting really mad about the weaning process. If now they get an extra book that you're reading them to bed, or there's some other type of routine that you insert and that didn't exist before when you were actually breastfeeding the child, this whole new routine can help take their mind away from the fact that they're missing that feeding. And that can be really, really helpful so that they're not so mad about the weaning process. Remember that toddlers don't have a lot of impulse control. And so when they want something, they want it right away. And if you actually physically keep them from having what they want, they're going to get very mad and upset. And like my nephew cried all night long and kept me up, and it was quite traumatic for everyone involved. So we're going to talk a little bit about some cognition, some cognitive development that's happening in toddlerhood. And we've mentioned Piaget before. Let me just make sure I'm trying to get our pictures out of the way so I can see what I'm talking about. So in the first stage of development of his cognitive development theory is the sensory motor stage. And sensory motor is the name of this stage because the toddlers are using their motor movement to get closer to things they want to investigate and engage with them in a sensory way. So they usually want to just stick it in their mouths and taste it, or manipulate it with their hands and touch it. So they're using their motor movement again to get to those different objects they want to examine and learn about through their senses. So one thing that happens during the sensory motor stage is tertiary circular reactions. But this is when they try out new behaviors, especially with new toys. They're likely to try and manipulate them, figure out if there's a certain way that they can touch them or turn them in order to have a desired outcome or effect. And this is true of pretty much anything, right? So I always think about toddlers in a bathroom and they start to, put their hand down on the toilet roll and they notice, oh, the toilet paper comes out. And so they keep, going through that tertiary circular reaction of essentially batting at the toilet roll to have that same desired effect of the toilet roll, coming out, and eventually there's toilet paper all over the bathroom. So this is something that, they're trying out. They're little scientists, according to Piaget. They're trying to see this cause and effect reaction with all the things they're interacting with in their environment. And this, that outcome of the toilet paper going everywhere is very exciting for them. They get some satisfaction from that because they can observe that they are acting on the environment. They have an effect on the environment around them. Another interesting thing about the sensory motor stage is that they begin to build mental representations of things that they observe in real life, and then they try and emulate or recreate them in their own world. So this little guy here is kind of pretending to be a superhero, but in reality, he only has a towel wrapped around his shoulders and goggles on his eyes, but he is Superman in this moment. So he's using these objects, the goggles and the towel, to emulate or represent that idea of being a superhero with a cape and, maybe a cool goggle device. And little kids do this all the time when they play pretend. They might not have the exact objects that represent something. Like they might not have a doll's bottle to feed to their little dolly. So they might use a block instead. And that block might represent a bottle that they're feeding to the baby. So they can kind of pretend or represent in a symbolic way what they're trying to accomplish, what they're trying to emulate from the real world that they've observed. And we're going to see a video here in a moment talking about deferred imitation. This is something that Piaget said happened around 18 months. 18 months in toddlerhood is one of the most exciting periods of time. There's just an explosion of vocabulary happening for most children. They become really more complex in terms of personality and capabilities. But one thing that Piaget said that they're able to do at this stage is that they might observe something happen in real life and or via, maybe a video or a TV show, and then time will pass and they will try and imitate what they saw happen in real life or in some other capacity. So if they saw, someone try and fly off of a chair in, at the daycare, they might go home and try that same thing. So they're learning, they're observing, they're latching onto ideas, and they have this long-term memory that allows them to imitate these capacities later, not at the same time that they're viewing them. So I'm going to share, share my sound. Oh, no thanks. All right, I'm gonna go.
We think that the next decade will be the frontier of the brain. Just as there were revolutions in genetic sciences and there were revolutions in computer sciences, it's now time to understand ourselves. And one of the ways to do that is to examine the unique characteristics of humans and how the brain shapes that ability.
The Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences is a unique interdisciplinary institute at the University of Washington that was formed to bring together people from many different disciplines who are interested in the science of learning.
Patricia Kuhl and Andrew Meltzoff are co-directors of the Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences at the University of Washington. They are both world-renowned scientists conducting groundbreaking research.
There's been a revolution in our understanding of what's happening in the first 3 years of life. Scientists now think that children learn more in the first 3 years of life than they ever do again in any other 3-year period. The little child from 0 to 3 is making phenomenal progress in emotional development, in social development, linguistic development, and so forth. Watch this. The babies are learning a lot by watching us, and so we wanted to test imitative learning in the laboratory and have developed little toys like a dumbbell toy that you can pull apart and put back together. Again, pull apart and put back together. And we do research where a baby comes in the lab and is naive and doesn't know what to do with this toy. We demonstrate what to do with it and then put it across the table and see if the baby will copy us. We have a panel that you can lean down and touch with your forehead. It's a totally novel act. The babies don't do that on their own. But we can show the baby what to do with this device and then present it to them and see if they'll imitate, see the power of learning right in our laboratory.
Thank you.
When I was a graduate student, there was no measure that allowed you to assess what was happening in an alive, awake brain. What's happened in the last decade is that the newest measures can be applied to children. One is this event-related potential recording where the babies wear a nylon cap, and inserted in the cap are these little electrodes that just sit on the scalp, measuring the brain waves that are coming through the scalp based on the activities that are going on in the brain. So when a sound change occurs, like from ba to pa, or when you hear two different words, the brain has a characteristic signature brainwave that you can measure. So this allows us to take brain measures early and use those brain measures predictively. At 6 months, all of our babies are citizens of the world, meaning they can discriminate all the sounds of all languages. And that's a remarkable feat because you and I can't do it. But between 6 months and 12 months, something fairly dramatic occurs. By 12 months of age, the babies can no longer discriminate the sounds that don't belong to their native language. Now that's all happening before you hear any words whatsoever, because first words occur at about 1 year of age. So our question was, what's going on during this period between 6 and 12 months?
小狗西西，小狗西西的嘴巴，你看，
The experiment that we devised was to say, well, what happens if an American baby acquiring English comes to the age of 9 months, and all of a sudden we bring them to the laboratory, and for 1 month we present them with graduate students who happen to be native speakers of Mandarin Chinese. And they're just talking and playing. They read books in Chinese, and they talk about toys in Chinese. So the impressive finding was that the children who'd been exposed to about 5 hours of Mandarin Chinese were as good as the children in Taiwan. They had remarkable abilities to hear this just extremely subtle contrast. This sound distinction and the brain measure showed that the brain reacted differently than children in the control group.
The children are so curious about the world that when we sit across the table and test the children, it's really a stunning and heartwarming experience every time that you're in front of a baby. That's a fresh little mind that's looking at this problem for the very first time. If you go slowly enough, you can just see the wheels clicking inside their head. But at the same time that we scientists are looking at the children, what we see is a little scientist in the child looking back at us. I mean, we're sort of nose to nose. We're looking at them, trying to understand what's going on in their world, and the children are looking at us, trying to understand what's going on in our world.
Good job.
All right, let me close that down for a second. So what happens here with deferred imitation, what we saw him do is he was acting in live presentation, showing how to act on novel toys for the toddlers. And this can be done immediately after he acts on them. But another cool thing about deferred imitation is that a week could pass, 2 weeks could pass, and that toddler is going to pick up that same toy that they saw him do that novel action of just putting his forehead down on the toy to light up the screen. And suddenly they're going to act on that same object in the same way that they initially saw it acted on by him. And the cool thing about this that's really interesting is that you saw the live demonstration of Andrew Meltzoff acting on the toys, and also the live demonstration of the Chinese speaking graduate student. talking with the puppet to the toddler. And these live demonstrations are what are most effective in them acquiring certain skills. So whether that's distinguishing between different tones in Mandarin Chinese, or it's, actually knowing how to act on an object, it's the most critical thing at this stage in toddlerhood is that these demonstrations happen live. If you do them through video, there's what they call a video deficit, and toddlers aren't going to yet learn, especially around 18 months, how to imitate things that are happening from a TV or a video demonstration versus a live demonstration. Suffice to say, we've talked about this before, that infants don't learn from TV. Well, toddlers are not yet learning novel actions from that type of demonstration. Instead, they'll learn it from a live demonstration. The only thing we know that toddlers are actually slowly acquiring from TV shows around 18 months would be a few more vocabulary words. But if they were exposed to that vocabulary live, they would acquire much more language than television. So still, live interaction is much more valuable to toddlers than anything through a TV. Additionally, one thing that's happening as they acquire more language, remember they spoke their first word around age 1. So they're rapidly learning new language and categorizing different objects or live animals based on their exposure. If you take a toddler to the zoo, they might generalize. If you say that's a horse, they might generalize that to many different animals that are large and four-legged, for example. So they're categorizing, but they're working with your feedback to say, no, that's not a horse, that's a camel, or no, that's not a horse, that's a zebra, and zebras have stripes. And they start to learn these differentiations between objects and build categories. All right, so we're going to dive into Vygotsky for a little bit. We're shifting away from Piaget. Vygotsky had a more socio-cultural theory on cognitive development. So he, again, to remind you, is the Russian theorist who believed that we learn through social interaction different skills that are valuable within our culture. If it's not valuable within our culture, we won't learn that skill. But if it is, we will be interacting with people, and they will teach us little by little how to accomplish these different skills. So with children, they learn a lot with interaction from others. And if you think back to the Babies documentary, what child do you think maybe learned the most from those social interactions with other children? Just testing to see if you guys are out there. Come back. Any thoughts? Let me check my chat.
Maybe the one that was in Africa.
Yeah, so Pony Zhao, who was in Africa, definitely there was at least 2 children I can think of, but that one particularly because she was surrounded by all the children in her village all the time. And, she was learning how to work with a stone tool on another rock, and also how to balance things on her head. And all of this was an exchange between her and other children. So she was constantly, kind of learning about her world through these social interactions with children. And they were teaching her how to master these skills. And so she was able to emulate them doing these skills. Another child who had a lot of interaction with other children, or at least one other child, is Bayer Jagal in Mongolia. And it maybe was not the most positive interaction. Maybe Bayer was learning how to be naughty because his older brother was not the kindest to him. But certainly children learn different skills, and they'll act out those skills that they observe other children doing. Culturally, what children need to know is determined by what context they live in. So what kind of skills do you think that Bayer will pick up, the little boy in Mongolia, over time, just based on his environment and what might be valuable to know in his culture?
Probably stuff about taking care of animals.
Yeah, farming, right? Like he has all this exposure to animals. He might learn how to like clean a dead carcass, for example, or milk a cow. Um, a lot of agricultural things. Similarly, if we think back to Pony Zhao in Namibia, what kinds of skills do you think she will learn are valuable for her to know?
She was already learning how to balance stuff on her head.
Yeah. And I mean, thinking about observing what the other women in her community were doing, like as she grows into a woman, what other skills will she learn from the women in her village?
How to take care of babies too when she's
How
a
to take
mom.
care of babies, how to feed them, right? How to keep them healthy. Like there were a lot of different skills, caregiving skills that we observed her mother do that are differently performed in our culture, but as equally effective in hers. And then if we think back to like Mari and Hattie in these more developed countries, what kind of skills do we think are culturally valuable in those contexts of Tokyo and San Francisco?
Reading.
Reading, yeah. Knowing how to read, being literate. Anything else? It's hard to put our finger on it because we are immersed in this culture, right? What is important for us to know or be able to do one day?
Would communicating be one? Like speaking?
Yeah, speaking skills. I mean, I think speaking skills is probably, well, I wouldn't say equally valuable across culture, although all children are going to learn how to, they're going to learn language, but maybe like writing, typing, music seemed to be a value in at least San Francisco, critical thinking, like passing high school, going to college. These are some things that are culturally valued, or at least, maybe expected of a young child, and that's conveyed through the experiences that they expose the child to. They want them to have broad exposure to cultural experiences, be it at a museum, at the zoo, at a music class. So there's some kind of expectation in our culture that, to be successful, essentially, to be self-sufficient one day. All right, so here's Lev. He, again, passed away at a very young age, so this is probably one of the last photos taken of him, but he said famously, "What a child can do today with assistance, she will be able to do by herself tomorrow." So he believed there's a lot of value in assisting, providing scaffolding is what he would, say specifically, or support for a child to accomplish something with your help, so that they little by little can accumulate this skill on their own independently in the future. So he defined what he called the zone of proximal development. And that is, I have a good image of it over to the right here. So I want to talk about this image. In the middle, we have the zone of proximal development. On the left, we have things you can do by yourself, all on your own. So with toddlers, they can walk. They might be able to have, they might have a few words to communicate what they want to, what they want, like I want milk, or I want to go to bed, or, I want food. And then there's things that they could never do, no matter how much support that you gave them. Like they're not going to be able to type a 5-page paper. They can't do anything with a computer at this point in time yet. Or they might not be able to, let's say, walk a tightrope. These are things that are way outside of their skill capacity. But in the center are things that they can do with some help from a parent or an older sibling. And that's the sweet spot. That's the zone of proximal development, right in the center. They just need a little bit of help, like let's say with dressing themselves. They just need you to, put the shirt over their head, or make sure the shorts are not inside out, and that the label is in the back and then they'll step into them. But over time, they can learn what's important, those little things, that little bit of support that you're giving them, and they'll take on those tasks little by little until they're independent in that task entirely. So scaffolding is that support that the parent or the older sibling provides. It's a degree of assistance that will, you as a parent, you only want to give as much support as they need. You don't want to overdo it. Another good example of this is when I taught second grade and my students were learning how to read. I didn't want to give them the sounds of certain letter combinations because that would give them too much support. I wanted to remind them, what's the sound that CH makes? And then it will cause them to stop and say ch. And then I said, okay, now sound out the word ch, chin, blend it together. So you don't want to give them that sound. You want to remind them. They have those skills. They will remember if they have a moment to pause and think about it. And that's the best type of assistance, the least amount of assistance needed until they can do that task on their own. So this led to an extension of Vygotsky's theory, which was proposed by Barbara Rogoff. She proposed this idea of guided participation, in which there's a teaching interaction between two people. This guided participation, I always think back to like math lessons. In math lessons, your teacher might show you up on the whiteboard how to do a particular equation, how to solve an equation, or think about it more simply, like how to add double-digit numbers when you have to carry over to the other place, to the tens place. And so they'll do it themselves on the board and you'll watch them. And then the second part is that you all do it together, and maybe you recall having whiteboards at your desks, perhaps during grade school. And then so you break it out and you'd have your little whiteboard marker and you write out the problem with the teacher, and they're doing it on the board with you at the same time. You're trying to solve it together as the teacher walks through that problem. As you problem solve together, that is exactly what Barbara Rogoff meant by guided participation. She meant you need to solve or do this task together interactively, and then you can try it independently on your own. So in education, we often call this I do, we do, you do. And the we do was that guided participation. The I do at the beginning was the teacher doing it on their own. The we do is the students participating and doing it with the teacher. And then the I do, we do, you do. The you do is all the students doing those worksheets perhaps on their own at their desk, quietly solving them after they've already received that guidance from the teacher. So this guided participation is really critical, problem solving together, or at least having an interactive engagement with some new skill that they're trying to learn. So you might imagine, for example, if we go back to Bayer Jagal for a moment, one day Bayer Jagal is going to learn how to milk cows, right, near his house, because they had a lot of cattle, and that's probably the exact milk that they drank in their home. And so his mother might teach him, okay, this is how you do it, and she's maybe holding the udder a certain way so that he can be more successful in the task. And then she's showing him little by little, she moves his fingers along the udder, and he can be more successful just in her little assistance that she's providing, maybe a little bit more pressure where pressure is needed, and he's not yet strong enough to apply that level of pressure. But they're doing it together at that moment, and then he will learn little by little with her feedback how to master that culturally valuable skill. So coming back to, I like that we already saw that video with Andrew Meltzoff and Patricia Kuhl, because Patricia Kuhl at the University of Washington is a giant when it comes to developmental psychology, in particular language development in infants and toddlers. And she was talking about how young infants, initially they are citizens of the world and they can understand differentiations in all sounds in different languages. But between 6 months and 12 months, they lose that specificity. They become only sensitive to the sounds within their own native languages that they're exposed to. So I'm going to talk about some critical parts in the brain that are developing at this time, becoming more specialized as the child's acquiring language and understanding more language. So I want to also underscore the fact that at least Noam Chomsky, who is a professor emeritus at University of Arizona, he would say that biologically we are wired to learn language, that it's innate, it's inborn, it's going to happen, even regardless of what kind of exposure you have. As long as you have a little bit, you're going to learn language as a child. He said this is because, in part we are, our bodies are constructed so that we have this very unique vocal apparatus that can create a lot of differentiated sounds. And other animals, sure, they have ways to communicate, but it's not quite as complex as our own very, very, specific, creative kinds of languages, and how they evolve over time depending on where you live. You might have different dialects, for example. Broca's area is the language production area it's within the frontal lobe. And if you are monolingual and you're right-handed, it's going to be on your left hemisphere, okay? So it's kind of frontal over to the left-hand side if you're monolingual and right-handed. This is not true if you're bilingual or you speak, multiple languages, or if you're left-handed, we know your language is more bilateral. It's organized between the two hemispheres. But imagine for a moment that you're the typical, I hate to say typical, but typical American has one language, and the majority of them are right-handed. This is not true of many other countries where it's common to be bilingual, but bear with me. So with Broca's area on the left-hand side, Broca was a doctor who actually had a patient, a unique patient who came to him. He could only produce one word, and that word was ton. And the really frustrating thing for this patient was that it was really clear when you talked to the patient that he understood what you were saying, everything you were saying, but when he went to speak and respond to you, all he could say was tan, 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 tan. So something was broken about his language production. And when he passed away, they did an autopsy on him, and Broca discovered that this patient had damage in this area of the left hemisphere, which he named after himself, Broca's area. That was responsible for language production. Now, Wernicke's area is it's within the temporal lobe, so closer to your ear, which is easy to remember because Wernicke's area is responsible for understanding language or language comprehension, okay? So if you're listening to language and it's coming in through your ear, it's very close to this area that is processing the meaning underlying that language that's being produced. And if you have damage to that area of Wernicke's area, then you can produce a lot of language. Unlike the person with damage to their Broca's area, you can produce a lot of language, but it doesn't make any sense. If you listen to it, the changes in tone, the variety of language that is spoken, initially it seems like, oh, this person is trying to tell a story. But if you really tune into what they're saying, they're not making any sense. And that is what we call aphasia when somebody has damage to their Wernicke's area, APHASIA. And it's a really sad condition because they can't literally understand any language around them. They can produce a lot of language, but they don't understand it at all. So an important distinguishing feature for humans is that we have infinite generativity within our language. We've tried to teach language, for example, to apes, and they are limited in their ability to learn and acquire and create an endless amount of sentences. So we're very generative. This is one feature that allows, for example, the use of Turnitin to test for plagiarism in papers. Because our language is endlessly generative, the majority of it should have never been created in that exact sequence before. And that's what that Turnitin software is sensitive to. It's like, well, we recognize this little excerpt here because it came from a different source. Because our language is generative, the way that I'm talking in this lecture, I won't even create the same exact lecture for the next class. It will be different because of the generative nature of speech for humans, because it's always so nuanced and varied over like from one person to the next. All right, so some key different language milestones that we reach during toddlerhood. You know, I do want to mention that we have at least one incredible vocabulary spurt during this time. Around 18 months is when they have like this, you know, verbal explosion, and they're going to be able to do what I'll talk about, I think, on the next slide, which is fast mapping of words. So they can acquire new words in, you know, multiple words within a single day, which is pretty remarkable. Then they would be able to apply them in, you know, contextual ways that make sense in the future. So from 12 months to 18 months, they have this slow expansion before they reach that 18-month mark. Initially, they're using a lot of hollow phrases. So this is when they use just one word to represent a whole sentence. So if I said up, 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 what I really mean is pick me up, Mom, or pick me up, Dad, but I'm only using one word. That word up is a hollow phrase. Or if I say milk, milk, it means I want to have some milk, please. But I'm only able to say that one word. So that's a hollow phrase. Overextensions are when we learn a new word and we over apply that word. Like if you learned the word fork, for example, and you applied it to all utensils. So you said fork, 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 even if it was a knife or a spoon, anything that someone ate with, you would assume that it's a fork, which is not true, but you're overextending that particular word to all utensils. Now, an underextension is also common during this period of development. This is when you apply a general word to a specific object. So for example, you would say that a cup is only the sippy cups you drink from. The glasses, for example, that your parents drink from are not cups. So you think that it's very narrowly applied when in fact it's more generally applied. So it's kind of the opposite of that mistake with overextension. I think I'm just checking our chat really quick. Okay, I don't think there's a question right now about this particular topic. So at this time, the first 50 words or so are part of the toddler's routine. So they could be, you know, blanket, cup, milk, all these things they generally use in their day-to-day life are their first 50 words that they acquire and can produce vocally. Some other language milestones. During this naming explosion, the pace of acquiring new words doubles, and that's around 18 months. As I mentioned before, this, you know, explosion of vocabulary that occurs in which they're able to begin fast mapping or learning and remembering a word for an object after only being exposed to that word once or that phrase once. They learn a new word and they're able to apply it in a meaningful and accurate way. So I'm giving this example, I kind of alluded to it earlier. They learn the word horse and they might overextend it, right? They're applying it to a camel, a zebra, and a donkey because they all are taller animals that have 4 legs. But over time, their parent will differentiate for them and say, no, that's a zebra. Zebras have stripes. So then they fast map that word to only apply it to horse-looking animals that have stripes. And similarly, a parent might point out, you know, the camels have humps on their back, and you know they have a different shaped neck, for example. And so that is one way that they can quickly fast map that word to only 4-legged animals that have this unusual hump on their back. Another thing they do during this, between year 1 and year 2 is they use a lot of telegraphic speech. Telegraphic speech is when they take 2 words and they smush them together, but in a grammatically sensitive way. So unlike the hollow phrase where they only use 1 word to mean a whole sentence, telegraphic speech is when they use 2 words together in an order that actually maps onto accurate syntax within their language. And it has a much larger meaning. So instead of just saying up, they would say daddy up. And that means daddy pick me up. They're listing dad first as an address, addressing their parents, and then up meaning to pick them up. They might also say things like go now, or no thank you. They say a lot of things that they just smush them together to mean a much broader sentence, but they're at least able to put them in the correct place. These 2 words, they put them in the right order, that if they had all of the language to create the full sentence, the first word would be in the correct place and the second word would be later on in that sentence. And telegraphic speech is called this because when we used to use telegrams to communicate, we would take out all the articles or prepositions in a telegram to simplify our message and be able to communicate in a much more frugal way. And that's, again, the way that toddlers are communicating at this time. They don't have all those articles and prepositions to make a very complex sentence. Instead, they have the necessary parts to communicate their intended purpose. So milk please, daddy up, let's see, down now, things of that nature, or let's see, some other, like, I see puffs please, the little baby puff food and things like that. All right, I'm just checking. So some other language things that are interesting during toddlerhood. Again, this is just a really flourishing moment for language development in the whole span of life. So there's a lot to talk about here. During the 3rd year, toddlers become much more adept at language. So they don't use overextensions or underextensions as much because they have had a lot of feedback from their environment. Maybe it's a daycare caregiver, a teacher, a parent, another child who has corrected them. And so they stop overextending and underextending certain vocabulary words. And then they show greater understanding of the rules of syntax. So they understand, for example, in English, that we generally organize most sentences as subject, verb, object. This differs across different languages, but they begin to understand where the placement, for example, of a verb would go in their language and how to construct a comprehensive sentence. They also may show some over-regularization of applying some grammatical rules that they've learned and over-applying them in situations where certain verbs may be, or nouns may be irregular. So some examples of over-regularization, which I want you to be able to distinguish between overextension and over-regularization. When you regularize language, it means that you're trying to apply a grammatical rule to a word, whether it's a noun or a verb, based on the rules that you've learned over time. So for example, we learn to apply, to make a verb in the past tense, we apply the sound ed, ed, or d at the end of the verb. So for example, let's see, so now I can only think of irregular verbs, but I think of walked, talked, let's see, hiked, all of these verbs where you just add the ed to them and that puts them in the past tense. For kids, they try to apply this to different verbs such as to go in the past tense, and it doesn't make sense because to go in the past tense is irregular. We use the word went, but they will say, I goed to school today. And the boy hitted me. I eated some peanut butter and jelly, and the kid hurted me on the recess. So they over-regularize these verbs with ED, and they little by little will learn with time in the future during early childhood that there are irregular verbs and they have to change the past tense to be went instead of goed, for example. This also applies to plurals. So generally for most plurals, we just add an S or an ES, but of course there are certain irregular nouns like mouse, plural is mice, and little kids will say during toddlerhood, they'll say mouses, sheeps, horses, or shoesies, clotheses, because they're trying to make things plural that don't have a regular plural form. So these are little mistakes they make as they try and apply these overarching grammatical rules to our language that has a lot of irregular verbs and nouns. So right now we're at time. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I will also stop